I'd like to thank the speakers, first of all, that have come today. We've got a fantastic range of speakers, and I'm absolutely delighted that they've spent their time traveling quite a way, some of them, to come up here, so I'd like them to thank them for that. Just to very briefly explain, in case you don't know, the Scottish Union for Education was set up approximately 2 years ago, around, not quite, and the strap line, as you can see, is education, not indoctrination. Now, some people think that's quite a polemical statement, and I think it is quite a polemical statement. However, I do think the two things are connected. The concerns that people have about education, standards of education, and so on, and the issue of indoctrination. And without going into any great detail about this, does seem to be a problem amongst many educational leaders and authorities that they don't really seem to have a sense or a passion for education. And that, to me, is a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed, so that rather than knowledge being seen and understood as something that is incredible, it's actually now quite incredible to have to talk about education as being about knowledge, right, which is a peculiar situation to be in. And this is not new. You could stretch this back to the development of progressive education discussions in the 19th century. But I do think it's more intense today, and we have a much more serious problem, I think, in many schools. However, I also think there's a growing awareness of the problem, and a growing awareness that you do need to have a sense of knowledge and the beauty of knowledge, not just for education, but also for a sense of discipline and purpose. So with that as a framework, that's what we're interested in. I'm delighted you've all come, so do enjoy yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stuart Baird, a general issue teacher working not too far from here, enthusiastically working not too far from here, though some of my colleagues may disagree with that fact. And school's given all of us a great opportunity to see beyond the local, to raise ourselves out of the immediate and really try and grasp the reality of the world around us. That's what my experience was in the scheme in Kilmarnock. Perhaps not that scheme, but a scheme. I would though like to think, what would my younger self be like today if we had to go through Curriculum for Excellence? What sort of outcome would I have? Curriculum for Excellence is widely supported and is worth pursuing, says Education Scotland. With a backdrop of international decline that's been recorded in various reports, and a behaviour crisis that gets mentioned every other week in the media. I certainly can't really understand what we would be thinking about there. To help us understand, though, we've got a fantastic panel, fantastic speakers. We've got with us Tom Bennett, OBE, Glaswegian, Soho club manager, former teacher, and founder of the fantastic research-ed organisation which looks to try and get teachers to do the right thing, which is well worth applauding. Joining him is Joanna Williams, author, former teacher, visiting fellow, I would say lecturer, think tank guru, who also has a superb Substack that I would recommend you all read. They're going to be considering the question, what's gone wrong with Scottish education? And to get a flavour, I've got a couple of their books with me because they are prolific authors. According to Tom, behaviour is a curriculum. Being well-behaved is a combination of skills, aptitudes, habits, inclinations, values, and knowledge. These can be taught. According to Joanna, today's teachers, perhaps myself included, today's teachers are themselves the product of a culture that sees no authority in the past and little value in knowledge. Subject knowledge is edged out. The losers are children and education. Well worth reading both of these books. And I'd like to hand over to Joanna Williams, who's going to kick us off with What's Gone Wrong with Scottish Education?
Thank you, Stuart, and other Stuart. Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really, really grateful for the invitation. So thank you. I want to begin, if you don't mind, with three statements of a blindingly obvious, which I know everybody knows, but I think is just worth really putting out there at the beginning. So first of all, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, children in Scotland are no less intelligent, no less academically capable than children in England or children elsewhere in the world. Second, teachers in Scotland are no less capable or no less hardworking than teachers in England or anywhere else in the world. And the third thing I'd say is that actually I don't think anything that has gone wrong with Scottish education is actually unique to Scotland. I think the same trends that have led to declining standards in Scotland are very much present, or were very much present in England's schools prior to 2010, and are alive and well today in schools in Wales and large parts of America, and also risk popping up again and again in England too. So to answer the question, what's gone wrong with Scottish education, I want to focus on two things in particular. First, I think for several years now, Scotland's progressive, child-centred curriculum, as people have already alluded to, has focused on skills rather than knowledge, and on what children can do rather than what they should know. And second, and again, as Stuart suggested, I think the flip side to that is that politics has all too often been allowed to creep into Scottish classrooms in a very unhelpful way. And I think the combination of these two things together is that teachers focus less on academic standards and more on cultivating pupils' attitudes and beliefs. But I really want to emphasise this point that I don't think either of these trends are unique to Scotland and are very much still there beneath the surface in England. I think what we have south of the border often seems to me, and be very interested to hear from Nick Gibb later on today, is really a kind of a very elaborate game of whack-a-mole, you know, that kind of fairground game, where you've got, we are, I think, very, very fortunate to have a knowledge-based curriculum and exams, but beneath that surface, you've got kind of constant popping up of demands to make education more progressive, to ditch the knowledge-based curriculum. And I think where we have been very fortunate in England is to have had an Education Secretary, Michael Gove, and Schools Minister, Nick Gibb, who are in this kind of game of whack-a-mole, prepared to get the mallet out and use it to knock back down the progressive tendencies that kept on creeping up. And I think what they did that was very, very good, and that we're still benefiting from today, is that they legitimised schools and teachers who wanted to reject child-centred fads and pseudoscience for a more evidence-based approach to teaching. And I think we've really reaped the rewards from that. However, you know, as a word of sadness on this, I would say that since 2010, we've seen the departure of Michael Gove, repeated COVID lockdowns that saw schools closed to all but a tiny minority for many weeks at a time. During that period, the replacement of exams with teacher assessment, a subsequent return to grade inflation, the departure of Nick Gibb from office, a change of government, and a full curriculum review. And I would argue, tragically, that every single one of those changes has actually edged England's schools closer to what's happening here in Scotland, rather than what you would hope would be the other way around. But you know, again, to emphasise this point that what's gone wrong in Scottish schools is not unique to Scotland, I think it's so important to recognise that, because if we think there is something kind of just unique here, we risk the trap of thinking, well, all we need are like a few policy changes and everything will be okay. but I think recognizing that this is a much bigger cultural problem also suggests that we need to make much more fundamental changes. This is not just a question of, what 3 nice policies can we come up with, although that's not a bad place to start. So I think there's a kind of broader cultural problem or a dominant ideology that has, over the course of many decades, so these are not changes that have just happened over the past 2 or 3 years, even over the past 10 years. This is something which has, over the course of many, many decades, become deeply entrenched, a deeply entrenched way of thinking in what we might term the educational establishment. So I mean government ministers, civil servants, think tanks, teaching unions, teacher training departments in universities, and I think we have to be honest, a significant number of school leaders and classroom teachers as well. And I think this dominant ideology, this approach to education that exists in this educational establishment exists throughout Britain, throughout many countries. I think it's just been given more freedom to thrive in Scotland. But first, we have to be honest, and I think we have to face up to the scale of the problem. And I'm sure everybody here knows 2022 PISA test results really made clear that the performance of Scotland's pupils in maths, science and reading had been falling for 15 years. And while maths scores fell in all 4 UK nations in those 2022 tests, I think what's very interesting is that in England they fell from a 2018 peak down, but still stayed above the 2015 levels, whereas in Scotland the decline really set in 2006 and became far more significant in 2012. So it was a kind of continual slope downwards rather than a COVID dip and back up again. I think, though, there's only so much you can learn from PISA results. I think they're important, but I think it's a kind of, finger in the wind indication of where standards are at. They're a snapshot of time, and they focus very much on skills, whether children can read, write, and add up, rather than what children actually know. So that they're useful, but it's a limited use. And public exam results, as we know, are very difficult to compare because you've got 2 different exam systems going on in Scotland and England. And in both cases, both in England and Scotland, I would argue that if we look not just at the past 15 years, but again over a much longer period of time, look over 50, 60 years, and I would say the much bigger story is actually of declining standards being masked by grade inflation and by changes to the exam system that lead to ever more children getting more and more top grades, but set against a very, very long-term decline in standards. But I actually think what reveals the decline, again, both sides of the border, but I'm focused this morning's here in Scotland, is not exam results then, so much as what exactly it is that children are being taught. And I'm going to focus on literature for a few moments because that was the subject I taught myself when I was a teacher. So I was looking at the SQA document. It's a revised set text list for National 5 and Higher English that was revised and published this time last year. I'm sure some people here will be familiar with this. Popular texts that are suggested for that children should be taught, stories such as Tally's Blood, short stories by Ian Crichton Smith, they remain on the revised SQA curriculum, but the new list aims to be, and I quote, more modern and more diverse. So new stories that have been added, Duck Feet, I'm sure people will have heard of this, a 2021 novel that follows a teenager's experiences of high school and is written in Scots. The play Quatamur, forgive me if I've pronounced that wrongly, works by Jenny Fagan, poets Imtiaz Darker, Kathleen Jamie, and playwright David Gregg. There's to be more writers of colour, female writers, LGBTQ plus writers, and again, I quote, authors from a wide range of backgrounds. Significantly, one thing that comes throughout this document is the pointer that children themselves have been asked to contribute suggestions for the set texts. And the author of Duck Feet, Ellie Percy, she contributes to this new curriculum and sorry, I've probably used the wrong pronoun there, forgive me if I have. They contribute to this new curriculum and have their say on why it's important. And the quote is, "It is important for young people to have the opportunity to experience writing and stories that they can see themselves in. Engaging with your reader is often one of the biggest challenges facing writers, but having readers who can hear their voice in your characters gives you an opportunity to connect and reflect their experiences." And very conveniently, this comment is also echoed by Amelia, who is one of the pupils who contributed to the consultation. She said that her and her fellow classmates felt it was important for pupils to have the chance to study writing that reflected their lives and experiences. We said we would like the opportunity to read novels, poems, and plays that we can see ourselves in. So just to be clear, you know, I have absolutely nothing against writers of colour, female writers, LGBTQ plus writers, writers from a wide range of backgrounds. You know, bring it on. I think that's a great thing to do. But, and the but that is, there are a number of things I think that we can find to worry us in the justification, not for the authors, but for why these particular authors have been included here. And first I would question why they've included pupils in the curriculum review. I would say the construction of a curriculum is really an opportunity for adults to step up to the plate and think through what is it that we think children should know. And I think asking children to do this, to write the curriculum for themselves, is passing the buck. You know, it's saying to children, you have to have responsibility for your own education. We are abdicating responsibility for what you should learn, what we think you should learn. I think this is a real kind of progressive challenge to the idea that education is a means of passing on to children their intellectual inheritance or their birthright. Hannah Arendt's idea that education is an opportunity for adults to demonstrate they love the world enough to assume responsibility for inducting children into knowledge of that world has been rejected by SQA. And instead, it's not knowledge of the world that children are expected to take from their study of literature. It's knowledge of themselves. And you just think this is so narrow. I mean, why go to school to learn about yourself? You can do that, presumably sitting in your bedroom on your own. So the choice of authors troubles me because relevance seems to be the primary criterion for inclusion. And relevance is defined in these very narrow terms as being all about me. The focus on children seeing themselves in the literature suggests the purpose of reading, of studying literature, is not to expand your mind, not to enable you to experience worlds and emotions beyond your limited horizons, but almost like a therapeutic process of affirmation that you just see yourself. Again, you know, to prove a point I made earlier, this is not unique to Scotland. In England, Labour's recently published curriculum review, this is literally just a week ago, also echoes the refrain. I mean, it's over 250 pages long, but, you know, throughout this document, the phrase, all children must be able to see themselves in the curriculum, is repeated again and again. But the all here is interesting as well, because the all doesn't imply a common experience of childhood or a common experience of being British or even a common experience of being Scottish or being English. Instead, the all represents a potentially infinite number of different identity groups. So you don't see yourself in a collective, you want your individual group. So rather than seeing yourself in every part of the school curriculum, it's like, oh, now it's Black History Month, so this is for you. You know, now we're doing an LGBTQ author, so this is for you. And each child needs to have their experience kind of brought into the spotlight and dwelt upon. So I think a good curriculum should do exactly the opposite of what SQA suggests. I think the starting point should not be children, but literature. Rather than asking children about their lives, adults should think about what are the best novels, poems, and plays that have ever been written and that we think future adults should deserve to know. So when we aim to show children their own lives, we consign them to the present. And we see the truth of this when we look at the literature that SQA is putting on the syllabus, all of which, the most recent editions, were written in the 21st century. And this means that children are not being introduced to knowledge and culture from the past, or to the best that has been thought and said, but simply to that which is kind of most recent, most current. According to SQA, the only way that literature introduces children to new ideas is through diversity. So different identity groups then get checked off the list. But in the process, I think we lose any notion of literature as being something beautiful or meaningful in itself. The quality for criteria, the kind of entry qualification to be included in this curriculum is not the quality of the writing then, but the identity of the author. And that's my problem with the LGBTQ, people of colour, etc. checklist. You know, if they are writing brilliant and beautiful stuff, fantastic, it should be on the curriculum, but it shouldn't be on the curriculum simply because of the identity of the author. And when you go down that line, you know you're dealing with politics, not education. So let's just bear with me a moment. Let's contrast this with what happened in the past. And I'm going back a long way here, but I think it's an interesting kind of thought experiment. You can find online questions from a 1959 Scottish Leaving Certificate examination in English literature. Now, this is the lower grade paper. So candidates are asked to answer 4 questions in 2 hours, and options include, number 1, what do you regard as the best poem you have read or heard recently? What features of the poem made a strong appeal to you? Illustrate your answer as fully as you can by appropriate quotation. Number 2, which one of the following characters would you like to have with you in a position of danger and difficulty, and why? Salvation Yeo, Alan Quatermain, Alan Breck Stewart, Sherlock Holmes, Richard Hannay, or Horatio Hornblower. Now, as an aside, I'm embarrassed to admit, as a former English teacher, you know, there were at least a couple of names on that list that, to my shame, I had to Google. Embarrassed, yes. I mean, today's SQA bigwigs, you could imagine they would be having heebie-jeebies over such a list. I mean, they're all men. Most of them are white, British. They're all involved in one form of kind of adventure or exciting mission. These are the stories that they come from. But you think also, what do these characters embody? You know, it's bravery, stoicism, quick-wittedness, determination, courage. I mean, all those trends would be labelled toxic masculinity. I mean, that would all be well and truly out today. But I think what's important, though, and also quite sad, is that for boys especially, you know, okay, boys might not see themselves and their immediate experiences reflected in that list, but it does give you the opportunity to be genuinely excited by literature, to find reading a book exciting and inspiring and enjoyable. I mean, just purely enjoyable. But thinking about the nature of the questions assume children are not being taught to the test. You know, this is not saying, write about this particular poem, comment on lines 4 to 8, pick out 7 metaphors and 2 similes, and underline the nouns and the adverbs. You know, then there are no hoops to jump through here, no techniques that children are being asked to display. The only assumption is that children will have read widely and deeply, and that they will have enjoyed on some level what they've read. The knowledge of the literature specified assumes that there's this shared cultural realm, and the knowledge of these authors, these characters, these books will give children a connection, I think, not just to their peers, but to adults in society as well. Having this cultural knowledge of who those authors, who those characters are, will kind of give you a rootedness within the society which you're part of. I think pupils were actually expected to know about literature in 1959 and have such a familiarity with these canonical texts that they could make comparisons, construct an argument. It required classical education of the highest standard. And again, I emphasize this was the lower tier paper. I've got the higher tier paper, but I'm conscious of time, so I won't read those out. I think the important thing to say, though, is that this is not, I'm not just standing here kind of being nostalgic for a mythical past. You know, this was the daily reality for an awful lot of people who are still alive and well today. So my mother-in-law was born in a Glaswegian tenement before moving to a council house in Bridge of Weir, where her father worked as a decorator. She did her school leaving exams in 1959, passed with flying colours, very bright girl, went to university in Glasgow, and the rest is history. So this is living memory. You know, this is not some dim and distant past that we can't retrieve. And I think that, for me, is what's so tragic about kind of me coming here, standing here talking to you today, that it should be the other way around. You know, Scotland's education and quality education was such an amazing part of Scotland's history. I found this quote from 1708 from the author Daniel Defoe, praising Scottish schooling, writing that, and I quote, even the poorest people have their children taught and instructed, he said, in contrast to England's dark villages full of ignorance. I think sadly that is still true in some of England's villages today, because I think today's GCSE and A-level English papers sadly also for some way of this 1959 ideal. I think in England, you know, things are better, definitely, than in Scotland in this regard, but there is still a fair amount of teaching to the test, narrowly focused exam questions that require students to become experts in jumping through hoops rather than reading a wide range of texts, and sadly schools that game the system by selecting only the shortest and most accessible books. So, you know, you see kind of Christmas Carol repeated far too often because it's short and accessible. But you know, it's worth pointing out that thanks to the continued legacy of Gove's curriculum reform, you know, there is currently at least, far more than in Scotland, some attempt to have children study a variety of books, some more demanding than others, and from a range of historical periods. Sadly, it seems to me, really, though, that the differences between the English literature courses studied in Scotland and England really are reflective of the broader differences between the two nations' curriculum. Since education policy was devolved more than a quarter of a century ago, Scottish schools have been driven by a much more radical and ideological agenda. And the decline in PISA scores, I think, is notable, became really apparent in 2012 when the Curriculum for Excellence was fully implemented. And as I'm sure you're all aware, you know, it didn't specify key texts or knowledge. It sets out broad expectations for children's learning experiences, while the curriculum in England details, I mean, some would say too much detail, what children should learn each year. In Scotland, there are kind of benchmarks to ensure become a successful learner, a confident individual, a responsible citizen, and an effective contributor. So to sum up the problem with this progressive approach, it creates an education system locked into a permanent present, without a clear sense of purpose and direction, no academic standards to be met. I think very important, E.D. Hirsch makes clear, literacy is not simply a skill to be mastered. It's about far more than just a capacity to decode texts. You know, if you genuinely want to be able to understand and be literate, you have to have cultural knowledge as well. And that's why we need to look beyond the PISA tests. The progressive approach leaves children ignorant, so ignorant they run away even of what they don't know, but it penalizes children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds most of all, because children from more middle-class backgrounds you know, might have a family with resources, cultural knowledge, or financial resources that can fill in the gaps. So this is really doing children from disadvantaged backgrounds the biggest disservice. Very quickly then, to wind up, sorry, I can see, the absence of a knowledge-based curriculum then is the number one problem facing Scotland's schools. But I think the big problem for me is also what's replaced knowledge. When you take knowledge out and you create this vacuum at the heart of schooling, what comes in to fill the gap? And I think far too often you've got a progressive approach to teaching going hand in hand with progressive political views. And I think education in Scotland is overly politicised. You see this politicisation in notionally what should be academic subjects like history, like English, as I've already illustrated. but also in wider school activities such as choice of speakers for assemblies, causes taken up by activist teachers, and the personal, social and health education curriculum. The Scottish Government's Anti-Racism in Education programme, established in the wake of Black Lives Matter, aims to embed anti-racism initiatives and practices throughout every part of school life. I mean, of course, it goes without saying there should be no place for racism in schools, but it's through this initiative that you get the Decolonise the Curriculum movement. And that's why, again, to go back to this kind of 1959 exam question, that's why I think it's absolutely impossible to even imagine today children being taught. Charles Kingsley, C.S. Forster, John Buchanan, Arthur Conan Doyle, you know, decolonisation is not, people lie and say, oh, it's about adding in, it's about making more diverse. It's not, it's about taking out as well, and this is how we end up with duck feet. I'm not going to emphasize too much on the relationships, sexual health and parenthood lessons. I mean, needless to say, children are learning about masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, prostitution, consent, coercion, and pornography, because why not? Clearly, that's more important than Charles Dickens and Shakespeare. It's not just that these things take up time and time away from teaching. It's that it actually devalues what the classroom should be for. Teachers' hands are forced into doing this. You know, the Scottish Government actually makes it so that teachers have to engage in this agenda. The General Teaching Council for Scotland in 2021 produced guidance stating that all teachers must promote social justice, diversity, and sustainability. So rather than saying classrooms should not be places for politics, teachers are kind of forced to put the politics in. And I mean, words like social justice, diversity, sustainability, they sound nice. You know, these are kind of motherhood and apple pie words, but they mask very political and ideological assumptions. And the problem, and just very, very finally to spell this out, the problem with bringing politics into the classroom in this way, it's not just that it takes time and resources away from teaching subject knowledge, I think it represents a moral and anti-democratic overreach on behalf of the teacher as a figure of authority, and the school as a public institution. It really pushes the boundaries of what should be morally acceptable as the teacher's role. And it leaves children whose parents fundamentally disagree with the values imposed by the school at odds with the entire education system. So, very, very finally, to raise standards then in Scotland's schools, I think clearly teachers and parents here should not accept anything less at all than parity with England. But as I said at the beginning, Scottish children are no less intelligent, Scottish teachers are no less hardworking, so there's no reason whatsoever to accept that Scottish children should perform less well than their peers south of the border, whether that's at university, national exams, international league tables, whatever measure you like. But I actually think, and this is my last sentence, I promise, I actually think, you know, be more ambitious than mere parity. When England's education is moving towards disguising falling standards with grade inflation, and we've got now government ministers looking to swap GCSE in modern foreign languages for instruction in financial literacy, Scotland should aim higher than England, and the starting point's got to be removing politics from the classroom and then doing the hard intellectual work of thinking through not what children want to learn or not what children need to see themselves in the curriculum, but what adults think children should know. I really think we owe children nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Take a deep breath. We are going to go straight on to Tom. Take your notes, and once Tom's over, we'll be able to have a conversation of what we've heard. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take this side of the stage. No. I haven't earned it yet, please. And you never know what I'm going to say. It's lovely to be described as a Glaswegian. Thank you very much. It's been 30 years since I lived in Glasgow. When I was last here, Angus Ogg was in the Daily Record. There you go, thank you. Older members of the audience. And Greg's was called the City Bakery. Anyway, how things have changed. Oh yeah, and you could walk into a school without getting a punch in the face, which is why I want to talk about behavior in schools, because it's something very close to my heart here. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? I don't know what I'll do if you say no, but I presume you can. So I've been working in the behavior sphere for many years now, in part thanks to this young gentleman in the front row. Working particularly, obviously, in the English system. I worked as a teacher for about 15 years in very challenging inner-city comprehensives in the East End of London. They used to call me Shrek, which was quite nice. I think it was the accent. But they sounded like Dick Van Dyke, so who cares? Anyway, so I really enjoyed that, but I really struggled with behavior. And as was so beautifully pointed out before, I used to be a nightclub manager in Soho, which is a natural transition into teaching, of course. Religious studies, no less. And I found behavior very, very hard, and I thought, why aren't children behaving? And when I asked my tutors and the mentors and the people who trained me, what shall I do with this class who are running around me like a maypole? And they said, you just need to build a relationship with them, Tom. Thanks very much. I thought for a second you were going to be vague there about it, but no. Clear, clinical, practical advice there. Thank you very much. So, I asked them, how do I do this, O wise one? They kind of glided away like the Buddha and said, oh, we can't tell you. You have to discover it for yourself. Thank you, Obi-Wan. And so I walked into the class and tried to build a relationship with my kids, which, may I just say, I'm going to stake my little flag here. Behavior management is very much about relationships, right? But telling someone to just build a relationship without telling them how to do it is like asking someone to fly a helicopter. I know what the words mean, but I don't know how to do it. So I ended up trying to be their pal, right? And that worked a treat, as you can imagine. Right? They don't need a tall, but they've got pals. They don't need me. I'm not Mr. Tumble, However, that resonated. Good, I'm glad you've seen it. And it was hellish. It was absolutely hell. And the advice I was given was terrible. And I remember, sorry, I have to digress. I was told by one of my mentors with this particularly difficult Year 10 class, he said, have you ever tried putting the worst behaved kid in charge of the lesson? Right? Now that would get you a gold star in Scotland, I suspect. And I said, no, I haven't thought about that because it sounds like a freaking stupid idea. And, sorry, it's a bit early for that. And so I did, so I took the worst behaved kid in the room. Let's call her Katie, because that was her name. And she's probably a head teacher now. Works in the DFE. And I put her in charge, and she proceeded to do the Shrek impression for 45 minutes. She thought it was Christmas. And I sat at the back of the room with my head in my hands thinking, what am I doing here? And a kid next to me said, what are you doing, sir? And I said, I don't know. I'm 35 years old, and I don't know what I'm doing here. Madness. And by way of preamble, also I should also say, when I went back to my mentor, and I said to him, that was a hard lesson. He said, oh yeah, did it not go well? I said, no, not very. How did it go when you did it? And he said, oh, I've never done it. Thanks for that. So, that's where we are. Why wasn't I trained in any of this? Well, many of the mistakes that were made 25 years ago when I was trained to be a teacher, sadly, I still see in Scotland. And again, this isn't about some kind of English supremacism. I was asked about, 12 years ago to advise on behavior. I think there was a Scottish quota that there was a deficit because Michael Gove had left, so they had to get somebody Scottish in. I'm really fortunate. I've been to about 1,500 schools now, around the world. Like MC Hammer, I've been around the world from London to Dubai. Thank you. I just lost half the room with that. MC Hammer was a pop star from the olden days, I should probably mention. And I've seen lots and I just look at behavior. That's all I do. State schools, indie schools, coastal, rural, urban and suburban, special schools, alternative provision, virtual schools, they're hard to get into. All these schools, trying to see what it is that makes classrooms tick and makes schools tick. And you know what? The weird thing is that I keep circling back to some ideas which are very easy to understand. Now, this isn't a session on how to run a school or a classroom, but I think what's really interesting is that Scotland is currently, and for some time, has been in the grip of an ideology which is completely at odds with the realities of how you manage behavior. And I've been to all these schools, and listen, that doesn't make me any better than anyone else in this room. I'm good at behavior. I better be good at behavior, but I'm no better than many people here, for those of you that have taught and so on. But I've got that perspective. I've seen what brilliant people do. And a lot of it wouldn't surprise you. And a lot of it is teaching the behavior you want to see. A lot of it is having clear boundaries for the children and high expectations. A lot of it is showing the children that they matter, but that they also matter enough that you're going to challenge them if they don't do the right thing. A lot of it is occasional, mild, persistent, predictable penalties, but also lots of support for kids who need it. Stop me if I'm going too fast. But in Scotland, and may I just say, in many other territories throughout the world, this is not a uniquely Scottish virus. And also in England, when I began as a teacher, the paradigm was very much, have you thought about putting Katie in charge of the room? Why? I don't know. Let's just try it. So let me reflect on where we are just now. I've called this session The Road to Hell. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. A wee light-hearted session for you. Now, there's no clicker here, so apparently I just have to kind of go click. There we go. And that was slide 1 of 956. I'm going to try and beat Joanna's record there. There are no words left. You've used them all. Thank you very much. Right. But they were all wise, thankfully. And also you wrote them down, which I thought was great. Here I am off the cuff. I feel such a fraud now. Now, you see before you the litany of shame of Scotland. And I say this because I care. I'm not trying to knock Scotland. I wish I could come back to Scotland and go around the world and say this is the best education system in the world. That's what I want. That's what I used to think. Sadly, that's what a lot of people still think. And I find that Scotland is still locked in this kind of hermeneutically sealed chamber where there seems to be an enormous level of consensus and an enormous level of right think and an enormous level of don't speak out. There is an omerta in Scotland about factors like this. I will try to keep it to behaviour, although I could echo everything Joanna said about the curriculum for excellence, which is neither a curriculum nor excellent. In the same way that hot dogs are not dogs and French fries are not French. You cannot just simply say it's excellent and say, well, that must be great then. This is my excellent speech. Now you all have to clap. There's multiple details describing how bad things are in Scotland in terms of the behaviour. Whether your barometers are things like how many teachers are getting punched, how many people go to A&E, and so on. And the sad thing about it is that there's not really a lot of official data on this, that you have to really, really look hard for it. You have to do freedom of information and so on. You have to do surveys of teachers by unions. And this is exactly the way it was in England back in 2008, 2009, that everybody said it was great. And even the chief inspector for Ofsted, HMCI for Ofsted said, 85 to 90% of schools are better, good or better in terms of the behavior. Aren't we wonderful? And yet every school I went to had problems. Particularly my classrooms. It may have just been me, right? But it's not, because the more I traveled the world and saw different schools, I saw this was a very, very common issue. Children push back. Children test boundaries. Children bring all the pathologies and anxieties of their lives into the classroom. Some children have got extremely complex and challenging needs in their own lives. And all children are human, and we're all capable of making mistakes. In fact, not just mistakes, we're all capable of not just making bad decisions, but sometimes we can be cruel. Can we not? Sometimes we can be mean or racist or selfish. These aren't necessarily bad choices that we can simply convince children to change with therapy. This is intrinsically part of who we are. Sometimes we make wrong decisions and more. Now, next slide, please. When I came back to Scotland and I started to kind of plough my little furrow here, I found that but most of the teachers I spoke to were saying things are really challenging, things are really tough, particularly if you worked in special ed, particularly if you worked in schools with less than leafy demographics. And that's one of the other things which I found, that if you work in a school in the Swiss border or the Cotswolds or something like that, if you teach nothing but the sons and daughters of American diplomats, then you'll find that the behavior's quite good. Because a lot of the behavior of children stems from the environments in which they're raised. That's not a critical statement, incidentally. It's just a simple admission of fact that when children are exposed to risk factors in their life, like neglect or trauma or abuse or poverty, or just chaos even, you tend to find that those children statistically are overrepresented terms of the antisocial behaviors that develop as a result of those risk factors, which tends to lead to lack of later life success. Surprise, surprise. If you teach in Mallory Towers, I don't know if Mallory Towers still lands. Yeah, well, you know, I was going to say Hogwarts, but they literally killed their head teacher, so that's probably not a good example, you know. It's really bad. I mean, that's frowned upon these days. But if, you know, you'll get one profile, you'll still get bad behavior in Winchester and Eton and Rugby and so on, but it's usually international banking fraud. Thank you, you're welcome. I always play to your audience. Whereas if you go to, I was going to say Grange Hill, but again, I'll lose a lot of you there. If you teach in Waterloo Road or something, you know, then you get a different profile. So the problem is that teachers aren't trained very well on this. It's not just me. And I've led, and I've had the great privilege of with the DFE in England for the past 12 or 13 years, leading reviews into how teachers are trained. We helped to rewrite the National Behaviour Guidance for schools. I've helped to rewrite the mental health advice for schools, the suspensions and exclusions guidance for schools, and all the while I wanted to try to make sure that the teacher and the staff voice was inherent there, that this was practical advice rather than just legal advice. People are terrified of breaking the law, and perhaps they should be, but that's not what an advisory document should be. An advisory document should be, how do you do it? And there's very little of that prior to the work that was done over the past 10 years. So, not only are teachers poorly trained, but the leaders are poorly trained. And the ideologically driven behavior frameworks are still very, very common. And I'm going to mention some of them in the next slide, but things like the trauma-informed approach, therapeutically based approaches, restorative approaches, child-centered approaches, all of which sound amazing. And this is why some of this ground has been lost. And this is why some of these things are a wee bit seductive, because who wouldn't want to be trauma-informed? You know, who wouldn't want to be restorative? And may I just say, trauma is a real and devastating thing for many children and people in the world. Absolutely. And the impact it has is enormous. But most misbehavior in schools isn't because of some deep-seated trauma. You know, mucking about is not a pathology of character. Mucking about is the human condition. In the same way that getting a wee bit annoyed when somebody overtakes you in the motorway is. You know, and yes, there are some children whose behaviors are symptomatic of deeply suited pathologies, either neurological, behavioral, or cognitive. Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. But most children, most of the time, in most mainstream school environments, if they muck about, or they shout out, or they chuck a pen at somebody, or they're a wee bit late, or they call you Shrek, it's not because they're wrestling with some dark demon. It's because they're human. Maybe we're the demons, who knows? So, leadership training was also peculiarly bad. There was no leadership training. And that's the same way pretty much in Scotland. Any training that we do see in Scotland for leaders tends to be extremely fatuous and based on platitudes about expecting the best and so on. Moving on, please. Next slide, thank you. Good behavior is fundamental to student success. Everything we want to achieve at school is based on their behavior. I couldn't do this speech, whether you like it or not. I couldn't do this speech if you weren't doing this. What our mutual success in this endeavor depends on an enormously complex social compact between us all. In exactly the same way as success on the roads depends on everybody knowing how to behave and how other people will behave. And it's that communal social expectation which creates a sense of security and reassurance and predictability. I know where I should be right now. I don't know much, but I know this one thing. I'm supposed to be holding this microphone right now. And when children don't exist in an environment like that, when children exist in a chaotic environment, they do not flourish as learners or as human beings. Nobody flourishes in chaos apart from predators, apart from people for whom, you know, chaos is a necessary prerequisite to their success. Everybody else needs calm, safe, stable, predictable, dignified environments. Everybody needs this. These are the fundamentals of the social contract and of civilization and of any community that thrives and flourishes together. You know, you don't have to go back to Thomas Hobbes for that. Now, can you go back one slide, please, just for a second? And forward one slide. Thank you, I feel better now. Right, so, just checking where I was. Now, the previous guidance on behavior in schools was so threadbare as to be practically non-existent. And I looked and looked and looked and tried to find, where's the beef, where's the meat to this? And the guidance was essentially be restorative, be trauma-informed, and also be a fundamentally rights-based organization. And again, none of these are bad things. But I wouldn't start from there when I was designing a system for somebody managing a classroom with 25 kids. Because as Mike Tyson said, the famous educational philosopher Mike Tyson once said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Isn't that great? Out of the mouth, that's just brilliant. I mean, I'm going to be devastated if he didn't actually say that, but let's just say that he did. Let's just say that he did. When you're teaching a lesson and a child says, this lesson's effing rubbish, mate, right? What do you do then based on this? Quick, let's have an immediate restorative circle. Are you joking? Or do I think, I wonder what trauma this child is experiencing? What about my trauma? But more seriously, what about the alleged trauma of everyone else in the classroom who now exists in an environment of instability, chaos, and threats? What about them? Who's vulnerable here? What do we mean by vulnerable? Vulnerability isn't a binary concept. It's a spectrum. It's fluid, as so many things in Scotland are. You're welcome. And do I think, I wonder what their human rights are in this matter? This is important, but it's not where you would start when you're saying to a teacher, here's what I want you to do next. And this is the problem. The behaviour guidance in Scotland has been written by people who've never managed a classroom. Let me rephrase that. Never managed successfully a challenging classroom. And I'll die on that hill. I will stick my neck out. I will plant my flag. I will fly my freak flag freely here to say that. People for whom there is no consequence to being wrong, other than their friends and allies congratulating them on how empathetic they are, and how kind they are, and how caring they are, and how much they love and center children in all of their practices. If I am unmannerly, well, be Kent unmannerly when Lear is mad. And I'm so fed up with this stuff. And I used to be more gentle about how I spoke about this kind of thing. But it's just, there's no time. We'll all be dead one day. I want to say this while I'm still here. Next slide, please. I'm not going soon or anything, sorry. That sounded quite dark, I apologize. I intend to finish this session at least. The 2018 guidance, same thing. High expectations, restorative methods, support for neurodiversity. Who could disagree? These are all lovely things, but I wouldn't start there. Next slide, please. I'm speeding up now. Thank you. Now, there was change. There was new guidance. Perhaps you noticed some of it fairly recently. There was a response. And may I just say, credit to Jenny Gilruth. I don't know how many people will say that today, but credit to her. No, genuinely. When I moved back to Scotland 5 years ago, like Gandalf, like a pilgrim coming back, and I remember thinking, I wonder if they might like just some thoughts. And all credit to her, she said, yeah, let's meet, and I had a good chat with her. Obviously, I clearly wasn't very persuasive. But I thought that showed at least the presence of mind to have the character to ask for, to listen to other people's opinions. And there was lots of pressure now, and I've been banging my little tin drum for the past few years, and some of the unions have been doing the Lord's work here, and organizations like Sue and so on, and I'm sure many people in this room have been saying, no, enough is enough. The problem is, of course, in Scotland, there's this dreadful omerta that if you do speak up, good luck with your career progression. Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? Which is why social media, from my mind, has catalyzed and activated so much of this discussion, but particularly people who are anonymous, particularly people who have retired. That kind of thing. These are the types of people who openly say, we need to have some change here, and it's not good enough. Because, of course, who wants to lose their job? Who wants to kill their career progression? Of course, that won't officially happen. It just does happen. That's the problem. There's no guidance that says you can't use sanctions, but it is frowned upon in such a way that, culturally speaking, it's practically impossible to suspend or exclude a student. Of course, the famous case of, was it one child in Scotland excluded last year or the year before? One child. And yet there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of assaults on teachers. Are you kidding me on? Someone punches you in the face and the kid stays. What are we asking teachers to put up with? I know what we're asking them to put up with. We're asking them to leave in droves. We're asking them to be a punch bag. We're saying to them, we want teaching to be a high-status profession. Now, please accept a punch in the face. And if anything happens, we won't do anything because we love children much more than you. Again, these are the words of people who do not have to pay the bill for a tab that they run up. This appalls me. Anyway, moving on, please. Thank you. Main criticisms, again, still, the reason why people were criticizing the previous guidance, it was too soft, that it wasn't addressing violence, that it was inadequate in things like consequences and boundaries. And again, a lot of this was coming from unions, and unions were saying this, and people like me and other people in classrooms. I'll give you time to take a picture. Next slide, please. Now, thankfully, help is on the way. The horses are charging in. Help is here, and the cavalry has arrived. New Scottish guidance, 2025, June 25, fresh off the shelves. Now, this was, again, in response to the pressure that had started to emerge. People had been striking, newspapers were reporting, even some teachers were complaining, particularly some unions were making an issue about this. And they formed the SAGRABIS, the Scottish Advisory Group on Relationships and Behaviour in Schools. They must have not had my number. I can live with that. I can deal with the disappointment. But my fear was that this would be a talking shop that promoted exactly more of the same. Spoiler alert, it was. That this is a very common thing in politics. We've listened to you. We've heard you. We're having a consultation, which will kick the can up the street for a year or so. And then they will report back, and we will listen to the advice of the report. And now we have listened, and now we've implemented. And we will appoint people who will say pretty much what we thought they were going to say in the first place. Right? And again, it promoted high warmth, high standards. There were some nice things in it, like reinforcing positive behavior, some things about whole school approaches. There was a bit more of an emphasis on you can use boundaries and penalties and so on. But it was just left at that level. And the rest of the framework remained the same. Next slide, please, sir. Building relationships. But the problem is with building relationships is if you don't know how to build a relationship, you end up doing all these mistakes again. There was other things like, there was some money invested in things like professional learning for staff. I don't know how far 900K goes these days. A couple of pints at TGI Fridays, possibly. And that consequences were mentioned but not reinforced. That there was an acknowledgement that they mattered, but no guidance on how and when you should use them. And there was still the overwhelming preference that you should not exclude or suspend. And talking to leaders and teachers in Scottish schools, they frequently say to me, I can't suspend that student. The local council, the local authority said, I cannot suspend that student. Our rates are too high just now. Next question, please. Next slide, please. Main criticisms, still vague, still not robust enough, still based on the same old flawed ideologies that children will do the right thing if you just ask them nicely, if you just care about them enough, if your heart is big enough for them. Well, the Beatles lied. Love is not all you need. Right? Love matters. You must love or have a professional love, maybe even agape, for the kids that you teach. But it's not enough just to say, I really care about you. Why don't you behave? But thinking that somebody should behave in a certain way because of your emotional state is what stalkers say. When Taylor Swift doesn't return their calls. But I really love you. Sorry, I went a bit Billy Connolly there. I really love you. Hello. Right. Next one, please. Here is my 9-point behavior. I was going to call it the Bennett plan, but I thought that was going too far. You know? And here's what I think needs to happen. Have I got a few minutes left? Is that okay? 2 minutes. Oh, a luxury. I'll tell you a few stories on the way. Couple of things. Now, some of this is what we did down south. And let us not be dismayed because of where it came from. And I still get, and I may just say, in a country that I love, with people that I adore, I still get people saying we don't want non-English ways. But this is about evidence and what works. I don't care where it comes from. It's like getting upset about the boiling point of water or something like that. You know, because somebody discovered it that you don't like. This is the worst of cognitive biases we can possibly think of, and worst of all, it's stupid. In a country which had its own enlightenment, I'm particularly offended by that. People of Scotland, let us not be dismayed by these medieval fantasies. Let us embrace reason and rationality. I feel like John Knox here. Let us embrace reason and rationality in our practices. So number one, rewrite the behavior guidance. And I mean write. I don't just mean write some lovely flim-flam, abstract, theoretical, ideological lines about being restorative and lovely, and then leaving it at that and hoping nobody noticed. I mean guidance. Here's what you do with kids. Here's how to begin lessons. Here's how to end lessons. Here's roughly some of the principles that you run a school on an institutional basis. Leadership training and staff training. Practical training and advice. And the thing is, some teachers do get good training in this, but nationally it's a disgrace. And they get a lot of their worst ideas from some of the most august training institutions, which is tragic. And I speak to a lot of teacher trainers and academics in universities, and they secretly, many of them secretly say to me, I wish we could train and teach teachers in much more practical ways. But the guidance is that we tell them just that, children will behave if you ask them nicely and use restorative practice and so on. So remove the presumption against exclusion. Don't celebrate the fact you only had one exclusion. That's like saying we had no crime last year because we sacked all the police officers. Congratulations, you're an idiot. We need suspensions. Suspensions and exclusions are a healthy part of a working system. Now, it should be the in most instances. But for most behaviors, it should be at the end of a long road of trying not to exclude somebody. But the idea that we should, it's a safeguarding nightmare. You are forcing children to occupy spaces with their attackers and their abusers. You're forcing staff to do the same, who feel hurt and humiliated by the fact that they can do nothing because their leaders won't support them. That's what you think. And how did Joanna not get a 1 minute anyway? I'm just such favoritism here. She came further. I came from Edinburgh. Anyway, end the restorative default. You cannot solve behavior with the restorative processes alone. They are a very useful tool as a way of renewing and restoring relationships sometimes, absolutely. But you begin with a sense of, here's what you should be doing. Let me teach you how to do it because I want you to succeed and care about you. And here are your boundaries of what you must not do. And if you deliberately cross those boundaries, there will be a small penalty. There's a reason why people don't park outside Glasgow City Chambers or Buckingham Palace, if you like. That's for the English contingent. And it's not because we're all patriotic, lovely people. It's because you'll get a ticket. Your car will be moved. That's why people don't park in popular destinations, right? And when there's no penalty, people don't care. There's lots of wee villages up near where I live, Alloa, Tillicootree, and so on. There hasn't been a traffic warden there for 30 years. You can park where you like, even on double yellow lines. Penalties matter, not because behavior is motivated only by them, but because we need them in order to reinforce the behaviors we want to see. So we support sensible consequences. We celebrate them as a useful and healthy part of the process. Revamp teacher training, revamp leadership training. Create a massive network of alternative provision, either on-site or off-site. But you need specialist environments for children who need intensive care. These are not sin bins. This is not booting a kid into the ether. This is about putting a child somewhere where they'll get better support for the behaviors that they present. Small groups, more teacher-staff ratios, better training, and so on. These are a necessity. And for some children, they're a last chance saloon. And I've went to many alternative provision classrooms around the world, and they are life-saving. They are life-changing for some children. They are what they need rather than the same chaotic mainstream environments that many of them cannot handle. Mandate behavior systems via some form of an inspectorate. Nobody will like that. But you've got to check that people are actually doing it, otherwise people just won't. And then finally, and this is one of my favorite ones, survey staff and students, if you like your teacher voice, who doesn't, to find out what's behavior actually like in your classroom. We've got to lift this rock up and see what's underneath it. We did the same in England, and it was sobering reading, even after some of the work we'd done, that things were still not good enough, and that's fine. That's fine. Never let perfect be the enemy of the good, and I'm very happy for progress to be a project which we pursue infinitely and eternally. Ladies and gentlemen, to prevent this speech being infinite and eternal, I'm going to stop just now, but it's been an absolute honor to be allowed to speak to you. I don't take your attention for granted for 1 second. Thank you so much for your time. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Now, looking at the time, thank you. Looking at the time, we have got about just over 15 minutes. So the way I'm going to work this is that we are having a conversation, but it's going to be a very short conversation. I'm looking for questions and brief points. If anyone wants to go on a speech or a soliloquy, I suggest you write it down and send it into the Sue Substack, and we'll print it for you. But for those of us who want to ask a question of either speaker, I'm going to collect a few, and we'll get back to them in a few minutes, 10 minutes maybe. But I can have hands if anyone would like to make a comment. We'll take John at the front, and then Carlton, and then the chap up the back, and that's me dealt with the middle row. Should I pass this over?
There's a question for you, Joanna. How do we improve standards in English literature? How do we define what needs to be covered without ending up with simply a jumping through hoops approach? I mean, I'm thinking, if you're trying to teach grammar and you're trying to specify, we need to teach this, this, and this, and this, how do we do that without ending up with just a tick box list?
I'm going to collect a few.
Hi, thanks. There's a couple of questions, both relevant to each of the speeches. Is reform possible within the system? Personally, I don't think so. We need alternative schools. We need alternative centres for learning. And the second question is kind of directed to you, Tom, in relationship. I was at school during the 80s, and my school was pretty violent. I spent most of my time hiding in toilets, running away from people. The best teachers were borderline psychopaths, because you knew if you misbehaved, you would suffer. Is there a danger that there's a kind of bad behavior inflation going on here, in the sense that what now is considered bad behavior, maybe 20, 30 years ago, was just simply kids mucking about in class? And also, I think there's a question about the medicalization of discipline. ADHD, dyslexia become ways through which teachers abdicate their responsibility for teaching, I think. So there's a kind of medicalization going on here, and perhaps I'd be interested in your thoughts on the idea that maybe, I don't know, you know better than me, that bad behavior hasn't increased, it's just that teachers are unwilling to deal with it.
Thank you. We had a chap up the back who wanted to speak.
Well, this is a question for Mr. Baird, the last gentleman who spoke there. I better be careful how I say this. I'm aware of a special school where 5 children have been moved into a tiny classroom because the other classmate basically beats everybody up. It's an equal opportunity situation, children, staff, and whatever. And in the communications to senior management, it was decreed that the word assault should not be used in these communications, because the perpetrator was an 11-year-old child. In the staff room, I'm told, there are posters from both the council and the EIS saying that assaults on staff will not be tolerated. So I just welcome any comments on that situation, because the rights of these other 5 children in the class have been completely trashed, and that situation is ongoing. They're being denied a proper education in this situation to facilitate the one individual who is perpetrating acts of violence. Won't use the word assault, just as I'd welcome any comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I would make a point to Joanna about I work as an English teacher, and I completely agree with everything you're saying. But my question is more towards Tom. Sometimes the kids say to me, who's your favourite teacher? And I say, I hate you all equally. And they love it. You know, they enjoy being slagged off, they enjoy, you know, criticism, whatever, to a certain extent. And what that speaks to is a kind of toxic positivity in schools because of this lack of dealing with behavior. And that's led to a culture where teachers are sycophantic towards pupils, and you also, teachers have become incredibly immature, and you can't have adult conversations about a lot of the problems in school because, as you mentioned, it can damage career progression, but also the culture has become, you know, stifling. So I just wonder, even though I agree with your program, there's a big problem with teachers as well and accepting that kind of culture.
I'm just going to take two more, so I hope the speakers have got pithy comments. Neil, make it quick.
A quick question. Could it be that what went wrong in Scottish education is that what went right, but the central agencies didn't understand it?
One more, we'll go back and we've got a few over there.
As a parent of a child who's just started in primary 1 with 2 more children going to enter this system, I agree with all of your diagnoses, and I like the idea of your prescription too, Tom. But I'm looking really for practical advice for parents of children who are entering this system. If you're able to give some detail on that, I would be very grateful.
Okay, thank you. We've got a range of questions. Pick and choose what you want. It's going to be short and sweet, and then we'll have one more round out.
Thank you. First of all, on the standards in English literature, I think it's a really good question. And I guess in some ways, having said everything that I said and standing by it, I would to some extent defend jumping through hoops, and particularly with the things that you mentioned in relation to grammar, spelling, and especially reading. You know, there's no harm in having children jump through hoops as far as those things are concerned. You know, if jumping through hoops enables you to learn your times tables, learn how to spell, then let's have more hoops, you know, bring it on. By the same reason, I am 100% a defender of tests and exams. You know, I'm very, very pleased that the one saving grace, well, not just the one, that's a lie, but one of the saving graces in Labour's curriculum review for England is that they're not abolishing exams. They want to reduce them, but there's no massive overhaul of GCSEs, because I think at the moment in English schools, you know, it is the test that is keeping the whole thing, the whole show on the road, you know, and I'd far rather have teaching to the test than not teaching at all. And my worry would be that you scrap the exams tomorrow and the whole thing just completely implodes. So not all hoops are bad hoops, but I think in terms of literature, and you know, I'm looking a long way now, and this is into my ideal system. You know, clearly, as soon as you start putting hoops into the teaching of literature, you're moving away from love and enjoyment and appreciation of the literature, and you're getting children to drill down, and the danger is then the test becomes a question of meeting the criteria. You know, and I guess my real worry is that you then have some very, very bright kids who actually fail because they've kind of gone above and beyond the rubric of the exam. You know, they're kind of in exploring their ideas, they've not hit requirement 2A, 3B, and 4D, you know, and so end up failing. Very, very quick point on reform within the system or outside of the system. You know, I think schooling is so big. I think you have to work with the system to a much bigger extent. But I think you can also have reform outside of it as well at the same time. I think the good thing about free schools in England is that, as Tom alluded to, you know, there's a real danger if you go against the trend in schools as they are, you risk getting sacked. But if you're working in a free school where that is the very aim of the school and everybody is aligned and on the same page, you can do that without getting sacked. I think the other good thing about free schools is that it shows what's possible. You know, having alternatives shows that another way is there is another. You don't have to put up with what exists at present, and that, I have to say, is the real reason why I worry about Labour's attack on private schools in England. Not because I have any kind of huge interest in the exact range that fees should be set at, but by having private schools, it's also a way that you show what is possible, another standard that schools can be held up to, and you scrap that. You have nothing to compare what exists to.
Yeah, there were loads of questions there. I'll try to be pithy, but I'm not promising anything, if I'm honest. First of all, in terms of the reform that was mentioned there, I agree. It's a big old ship to turn. It's a hard thing to reboot completely and turn the off switch and on switch. I would suggest that a greater autonomy for local schools is a matter of urgency in Scotland. I think one of the best things that happened in English education, sorry for keep mentioning it, but is the academy programme. The sense that schools could become independent. They were still funded, but they could do things in different ways. Now, that meant some schools did some terrible things. Some schools were rubbish, and some schools were brilliant. And what that meant was that schools that were utterly failing could be rebrokered into larger partnerships with schools that were actually doing a bit better. And we now see some tremendous academy chains down there, like Arc and Harris and Star and so on, that are just doing the Lord's work with kids. I mean, turning lives around with the most challenging demographics, getting kids into universities if they want to go, raising their standards, making them sure they're safe and so on. I mean, this is what schools are about. And autonomy allows you to do that. And I think that the current kind of cold, dead hand of the state, it makes it very, very difficult for many schools to do so. So that's one thing. Second thing, we say behaviour inflation. Where that was from, yeah. The problem is nobody knows. And I mean nobody knows. That's the problem. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I spent 5 years at school sitting next to the worst behaved kid in the year through some kind of odd social experiment. The idea was that we're just going to rub off on each other. But the problem was I started stealing cars. So, when you gaze at the abyss gazes back, and if you lie with dragons, you become one. And he just spat on me for 5 years long. I remember thinking, thanks, teachers. This is great. And I went to school in Bears Den, the rough streets of Killamant. Anyway, the problem is that we don't know, and we didn't know in England either, because there was no nationally comparable annual data, which is why we started the National Behaviour Survey as at least a piecemeal way to walk towards that. We need to ask teachers, how often are your lessons disrupted, for how long, and so on. We found that in England, something like 8 minutes out of 30 was given over to disruption, which is a lesson per day, which is a day per week, which is a year per cohort. We find that out when we ask the right questions. Other things here. The special school thing. We're not going to define that as assault. Well, there you go, problem solved. I worked in lots of schools where they were recording behaviour issues, and one of the main behaviours was lateness or truancy. And I remember hearing a head teacher say, oh, there's too much truancy. Look at the figures. We look terrible. So they redefined truancy and lateness not as a misbehaviour, but just simply as a pastoral issue. And all of a sudden, the problem went away, didn't it? And that's the problem. You can't just talk things away by calling them excellent or saying they're not assault. An assault is assault, or battery, I suppose, maybe you would call that. And until we get to grips with that, we're not going to deal with the problem. Other things, I hate you all equally. Toxic positivity. I'm going to stick my neck out here slightly and say that when you say things like I hate you all equally, that indicates you've got a very strong relationship with those kids, that they trust you and they know you're being sarcastic, right? That's indicative of a good relationship. That's the outcome. The problem is if you talk to a bunch of kids that you've never met before who hate you, and you say, I hate you all equally, good luck, right? You can say that because you've done such great work with those kids. I remember there was a program called Educate in Essex, where one of the teachers there famously would say, clear off scumbags to his kids. And the Daily Mail went mad, or the Daily Mail as it was then, and lots of papers did. So there's an issue there. You can say that, but you're absolutely right. This sense of always saying that kids are doing the right thing and nothing they do is wrong is one of the biggest problems when it comes to behaviour. And I'm going to finish, sorry, I beg your pardon, I'm going to finish on the parental advice question, which was over there. It's really hard. It's really hard because the system is, behaviourally speaking, is so broken. And what I would suggest is that where we were 20 years ago in England is where we are just now in Scotland. I may just say, England's been a burning bin fire for many other things, but education we saw some real progress in. And I know Scotland can change. And we need to get through to the people who are in charge of these things. And what we did was we started to bang our drums and speak loudly about these types of things. And eventually we got through to teachers, and teachers became head teachers, and head teachers got into the system. And eventually people started to change from in the system. It doesn't hurt if you've got a few politicians with seniority and rank to actually also be pushing much harder from above as well. But push, push, push. The heartbeat of education is about 5 years. Let's see where we are in 5 years' time. Good luck with that. But in the meantime, you can make your children as school-proof as possible, and that's a terrible thing to say. By making sure they're literate, making sure they're numerate, talking to them, reading to them, expect them to do well, asking them about their school day, checking their homework, and asking the teachers, why hasn't this been done, and why are we doing 3 days on some kind of project which has got no educational outcome whatsoever? Be noisy. Have sharp elbows. And let's see where we go with that. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to take a couple more questions. Was there over here? Okay.
It's just a question about parents. Nick makes the point in his book that the level of accountability in Scotland is very poor. There's no legislative mechanism for accountability in comparison to England. I'm just wondering whether you think that's also a strategy. So you change guidance for teachers. Where do parents stand in this? And the other question, very brief, what do we do about universities where teacher training is taking place? Because regardless of all the policies, ideologically, they're completely, as somebody that works in one, committed, not just to child-centered view of things, but to the idea that teaching is the exercise of power. And is it almost an abusive process? How do we challenge that ideologically?
Hi there, I'm a parent. Tom, I actually attended your Research Ed conference 2 weeks ago in Edinburgh, and I was blown away by a lot of the teachers that I met and the things that I learned at that conference. But given the concerns around Scotland's educational establishment and its guiding policy without research, without evidence-based techniques, I'm a bit worried as a parent that is because I listened to the advice you just gave to that gentleman over there as a parent. I do have sharp elbows. I'm constantly questioning my son's school leadership team. And I'm really worried that as a parent, I understand more about the research on how a child's brain learns than the leadership of my child's school. I'm truly terrified. So I'm a bit worried that we're kind of potentially in a system or a doom loop where the establishment has taught all these teachers, the university has taught all these teachers, and they think that this is correct. And I'm just wondering how I, as a parent, like a noisy parent, can work with teachers or work with other people in order to change the establishment at the top, because that's clearly where the problem is. But I just feel like I'm beating my head against a brick wall. What can we as parents do to support this cause?
Two more.
Hello, I'm a school librarian and have been for the past 30 years, and I've spent the past 30 years banging my head against a brick wall, trying to encourage teachers, English teachers included, in seeing just the value of literacy. We're now in Glasgow, and I don't know how many of you know, every single professional school librarian will lose their job at the end of the year. I think that's a reflection of how Scotland sees literature and literacy. I myself am across two of the largest schools in Scotland. I have 4,000 pupils that I am supposed to build relationships with, so they get about 10 seconds each. I advise you all to read a fantastic book called The Kind Librarian, because she talks about the difference between being kind and being nice. An example of that is if you are nice, you might not give your class a test. If you are kind, you give your class a test, but you help and support them to pass it. Please support your school librarians. We're a dying breed.
Thank you.
It's a question for Joanna. You alluded to the fact that in England, there are forces trying to emulate Scotland, which I think if you could say a bit more about what are these forces, where it's coming from, and why. Is it got something to do with children shouldn't feel traumatized in the classroom by getting a lot of knowledge thrown at them? Because it seems really daft, given that the results are showing that England, the knowledge-rich curriculum, which is teacher-led, is more successful than what we've got here in Scotland.
Thank you. If you can do with that with what you want, and then hit us with your ending.
Yeah, first of all, on the question over there about universities, I actually thought you were going to stop at just what are we going to do about our universities, and I think that in and of itself would have been a great question. I have to say, I'm sure many people here have read Nick's book, and if you haven't, it's definitely worth reading. And actually one of the things that upset me about your book, Nick, was you read about all these great changes and developments that have happened in school, and then it kind of stops at the point at which they go to university. And I've had this brought home to me very, very personally recently by my daughter, who's just finished had recently finished her first year at Manchester University, who said to me, I just don't understand why I learned so much more at school than I'm learning at university. And that I didn't know how to answer her. You know, it really shocked and upset me that had been her experience. And so I guess the reason why I'm saying this is I think the problem with teacher training is that it is located within universities, and so it sucks up all the problems that are existing within our universities and capitalizes on them and exacerbates them and makes them even worse. So I think if I was in charge, I would remove teacher training from universities completely. I would have people learning how to teach in schools with the support of experienced practitioners. I mean, maybe make a new kind of level of teacher who is not a head teacher or a school leader, has no kind of management responsibility within the institution, but is like a kind of a consultant teacher who can help new recruits into the classroom. That would be my idea. I think this actually ties in with the question about librarians, or the comments about librarians as well. I think there's kind of a danger a little bit with a conference like this, inevitably, that we talk about schools as institutions, and as part of the education system, but they are also part of a broader culture and the broader society that we live in as well. And if we have a culture that places no value on learning, no value on literature, then perhaps, sadly, our schools are reflecting that broader culture, and especially our librarians too. The question about Scotland and England, the relationship, I think this progressive movement, I mean, it's a century old, you know, the progressive, or even more than that, you know, depends on how far back you want to go. You can look at Dewey, you can look at the kind of counter-enlightenment movement going way back into the 18th century. You know, Rousseau, not Dewey, Rousseau, you know, and then Dewey, and you can look at the influence of these figures, and I think that trend in education has always been there, and in a way you can understand emotionally the appeal of it, you know. And certainly it was something that impacted me in my experience as a teacher. I remember one particular job interview I went for, you know, what I was asked directly, I mean, this is more years than I care to remember, and certainly before Gove and Gibbs school reforms, you know, what was my kind of driving philosophy as a teacher? And I started banging on about my love of literature, and you could tell from their completely blank facial expressions, this was the wrong answer. And up until that point in the interview, I'd had every indication that they actually really liked me and really wanted to give me the job. And you can see they're teasing it out of me. I had to say, but I love children more, you know, and you know, my real guiding philosophy is to be child-centered. And you know, that dynamic, I think, is just there, you know, and it's an impulse that we are challenging. And I think the important point to make is that kind of being knowledge-focused is not anti-children, it's not hostile to children. It's not like when I was saying I really want to be an English teacher because I really have this love of literature I want to pass on to the next generation. I wasn't saying because I can't stand children and want nothing to do with them. You know, I wanted to communicate my love of literature to children. That was the important point. But I was doing that because of a love of literature. And so I think this is a trend which is driving education everywhere, and it is something that this kind of progressive ideology is something I won't say more because I'm sure it'll be talked about more this afternoon, but is a continual challenge.
That's a great point. I would just echo that. I think that I would also echo the point there that one of the main problems is this very bizarre assumption that teacher training should be located in the academy. Because most of what a teacher needs to know, particularly in the first 5 years of their career, is not located in the works of Paulo Freire or Foucault or Rousseau. You know, it's located in the blood, tear, toils, and sweat of the classroom. And while I think that teachers absolutely should if they love their subject and love what they're doing, have the option to pursue a more academic interest in the history and the exploration of the philosophies and ideologies underpinning it. Absolutely, but you begin with, how do I settle a classroom? How do I hold their attention? How do I deliver instruction? How do I deliver information? How do I assess that information? And so on and so on. How do I sequence a curriculum? That's what you do as a teacher. It's like trying to train someone to be a chef. I was going to say wimpy there. There's no wimpies left, are there? Is there a wimpy? The Ivy. Let's go Buchanan Street. The Ivy. By starting off with molecular physics. And unless you're Heston Blumenthal, that's not going to fly, right? Anyway, I digress. So teacher training should be, in my opinion, is best located in schools with an annex experience from university to do some of the more theoretical understandings that sometimes we do need to have. Like, for example, understanding the needs and methodologies of working with children with, for example, ASD or ADHD. And so there's definitely a relationship to be had there. But some of the best teacher training I've ever seen has been in schools or school-based. So that's one thing. Parenting. You said, I have sharp elbows. I bet you do, right? Good for you. May I just say something? And this is a broader point. Having been a veteran of the Anglo education wars for some time, the great wars of Twitter, for many, many years, I can say this. We were in a very dark place in 2009, and you felt very alone and very isolated. You felt if you had a good idea, if you were lucky, it would reach the back of the staff room. And then we started to talk to one another. And then we started to talk to people from outside of the immediate locality and academics. We talked sympathetic academics, sympathetic researchers, people involved in policy, people who are budget holders and so on. And we started to collaborate. We formed research heads, for example. But there was lots of things happening up above, which we're very, very fortunate to see. My point is this, that while things look black, they looked very dark for us too. And if you recall the ending of True Lies, the sense of that when you see stars in the sky, it looks like there's more dark than light. But you know what? The light is winning because it just used to be dark. And that's where we are in Scotland just now. And I can only say, and this sounds like a counsel of both despair and pragmatism, but also hope, which is never false, as some people would say, which is that if we persist and persevere, if we collaborate, if we form groups, moments like today, events like Research Ed, conversations like these, blogs, posts, discussions, challenging question, why are you doing this? Ask politicians, vote for the ones you like best. The light can win. That's one last point. And the dark forces in education, that's a good question. I did like that. What are the dark forces? I'm a big fan of the King Arthur stories. Don't worry, I won't bore you with it. But I studied it at school. I studied Thomas Malory and Chrétien de Troyes and so on at school. The Mabinogion, forgotten days. And I was always struck by one of the stories of King Arthur, if you're a fan of it, that at the end of this lovely Camelot period, there were still people fighting against it. His son Mordred takes arms against them, and eventually they kind of slay each other at the Battle of Camlan, and the sword gets thrown in the lake. And I remember always saying, if Camelot was so good, why were people so upset? Now, that's a theoretical and aesthetic question, but I kind of see it resonating in the real world. If England's done so well, he says, I just pointed at Nick there, but England has done well. It's the one thing it's maybe got right. So why are people still so upset about it? Because there are some people who have been wedded ideologically so long to fantasies and to being wrong that it would break their heart to admit it. That when you've invested so long in the sunk cost fallacy, it is impossible to retrieve yourself from it. You are lost in the nexus of torment. And it behooves other people to say, well, you can think that, but you're still wrong. And there are people who are so lost in their own ideology and who will never see the results of their wrongness that they can persist in being wrong. So that's why there are still people, even in England, who are like, no, let's turn the clock back. And their job is just to keep fighting. You keep fighting until you drop. And that's my last bit of advice.
Rebellions are built on hope, they say. Thank you very much to Joanna and Tom. I have eaten into your coffee and donuts, so you might only manage a half, but let's get refueled and continue the conversation. Thank you very much.